In the year 1734, deep inside a mountain in the Austrian Alps, a crew of miners was cutting through a tunnel when their picks broke into an older shaft, a passage nobody knew existed. Inside it, they found a man. He was lying where the mountain had crushed him, still wearing his clothes, still holding the wooden tools he had carried to work that day. His skin was intact, his hair was intact, his shoes were intact. The miners assumed they had found a recent accident victim, some poor soul lost a few winters back. They were wrong by about 2,500 years. The man had died sometime around 1000 BCE, in the Bronze Age, before Rome existed, before classical Greece existed, before almost anything we would recognize as the modern world existed. And for all those centuries, the mountain had kept him perfectly preserved, because the mountain was made of salt. The same substance he had died digging for had refused to let his body decay. The locals called him the man in salt, and his discovery revealed something remarkable. People had been carving into that mountain for salt for thousands of years. Organized, industrial, dangerous work. A full millennium before anyone wrote a single word of European history. What nobody standing in that tunnel in 1734 could have known is that the story of this one mineral runs through almost every major event in human civilization. Salt built cities and destroyed dynasties. It financed Venice and helped ignite the French Revolution. It gave us the word salary. Empires taxed it. Smugglers died for it. Armies marched on it. And one thin man in a homespun cloth walked 240 miles to pick up a handful of it, and shook the largest empire on earth. So here is the question: how did a rock, the only rock humans eat, become something men taxed, smuggled, fought wars over, and killed for? And how did something once so precious end up sitting on your table, so cheap and so ordinary that you spill it without a second thought? The answer starts with a problem written into your own body. Every cell in your body is bathed in salt water, right now. Your blood, your sweat, your tears, all of them are salty, and that is not a coincidence. Sodium and chloride ions carry the electrical signals that fire your nerves and contract your muscles, including the muscle that is beating in your chest as you watch this. Without salt, your body cannot move, cannot think, cannot live. And here is the catch: your body cannot make it, not a single grain. Every bit of salt inside you had to come from outside you. For most of human existence, this was not a problem. Hunters got all the salt they needed from the animals they ate, the same way wolves and lions do. Blood and meat are salty. As long as humans lived on meat, salt took care of itself. Then, around 10,000 years ago, humans invented agriculture and accidentally invented the salt problem. A diet of grain and vegetables contains almost no salt. So the moment humans settled down and started living on wheat, barley, and rice, they became the first animal in history that had to go out and find its salt. Deer walk miles to lick salt deposits. Now humans had to do the same, except humans did it with mines, boiling pans, caravans, and eventually, armies. Think about that for a second. The entire drama you are about to hear, the taxes, the smuggling, the wars, the revolutions, all of it exists because farming made us the animal that has to shop for its own biology. The people who controlled salt understood its power very early. That Austrian mountain where the man in salt died is called Hallstatt, and the people who mined it in the Bronze and Iron Ages became so wealthy that archaeologists named an entire era of European civilization after their village. The graves around Hallstatt are packed with bronze weapons, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, luxury goods from thousands of miles away, all flowing into a tiny alpine valley that produced nothing except salt. The miners even left their wooden tools and leather sacks in the tunnels, where the salt preserved them so perfectly that researchers can still study the stitching. On the other side of the world, the Chinese were even further ahead. On the shores of Lake Yuncheng, people were harvesting salt from the drying lakebed perhaps 8,000 years ago. And Chinese states figured out something about salt that would echo through every civilization that followed. You can tax it. Salt is the perfect thing to tax. Everyone needs it. Nobody can make it themselves. And it moves through markets in countable, weighable units. In 81 BCE, the Chinese imperial court held a formal debate, recorded and preserved as the Discourses on Salt and Iron, about whether the state should keep its monopoly on salt. The scholars argued it was immoral for a government to profit from something people cannot live without. The ministers argued the empire needed the money. The ministers won. They usually do. For most of the next 2,000 years, Chinese dynasties funded themselves on salt. At times, salt provided as much as half of all state revenue. The Great Wall itself was partly paid for with salt money. And in Egypt, salt took on a different job, one that explains the man in salt, and one that will feel strangely familiar. The Egyptians preserved their dead with natron, a natural salt mixture harvested from dry lake beds. Priests packed the bodies of pharaohs in it for 70 days, drawing out every drop of moisture, because bacteria, though the Egyptians had no idea bacteria existed, cannot survive without water. Salt kills decay by drying it to death. The mummies that still exist today, 30 centuries later, exist because of salt. The Egyptians were using the same preservation chemistry that would one day keep a Bronze Age miner intact inside an Austrian mountain. They just aimed it at eternity on purpose. If China turned salt into state finance, and Egypt turned it into eternity, Rome turned it into infrastructure. One of the oldest roads in all of Italy, older than most of the city's famous monuments, is the Via Salaria, literally the Salt Road. It ran from the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River deep into the Italian interior, and Rome grew rich sitting on top of it, controlling the flow of salt to the tribes inland. Before Rome was an empire, before it was even much of a city, it was a salt trading post with ambitions. The Romans salted everything. Their favorite condiment, garum, a fermented salted fish sauce, was produced in industrial quantities and shipped across the Mediterranean in millions of clay jars. Roman soldiers carried salted meat on campaign. Roman salt works operated from Britain to North Africa, and when the state needed to keep citizens happy, it deliberately held salt prices down, the ancient equivalent of subsidizing fuel. And then there is the most famous salt story of all, that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, which is why we call a paycheck a salary. The word really does come from salarium, and salarium really does come from sal, the Latin word for salt. But here is where honesty matters, because the full story is messier than the legend. Historians have never found solid evidence that legionnaires actually received wages in the form of salt. The salarium was more likely money, an allowance connected to salt, perhaps for purchasing it, perhaps simply named after the most essential purchase there was. So no, Roman soldiers probably did not march home with sacks of salt as their pay. But in a way, the truth is more impressive than the myth. Salt was so fundamental to Roman life that it became the metaphor for earnings itself. 2,000 years later, in a language the Romans never spoke, you still ask whether someone is worth their salt, and every payday, you collect your salary. The mineral got into the money, and it never left. When Rome collapsed, salt did not. It did what salt always does. It preserved things, including, strangely enough, the map of modern Europe. Look at the name of the Austrian city of Salzburg. It means Salt Castle. The city's prince archbishops grew fabulously wealthy, taxing the salt barges floating down the river below their fortress, and they spent that white gold on palaces and cathedrals that still stand today. The salt is long gone. The skyline it paid for is not. In northern Germany, the town of Lüneburg sat on a massive salt deposit, and its salt flowed north along a route so vital it was simply called the Old Salt Road. Why did Northern Europe need that much salt? One word: herring. Every autumn, fishing fleets hauled in millions of fish that would rot within days, unless they were gutted and packed in salted barrels, where they would last for years. Salted herring fed the continent through winter, fed armies, fed the poor, and made the merchants of the Hanseatic League rich. It is not an exaggeration to say that barrels of salted fish were the fuel of northern European commerce for centuries. No salt, no herring trade. No herring trade, no Hansa. And in the south, one city played the salt game better than anyone in history: Venice. Before Venice was the city of canals and carnivals, it was a cluster of refugees on mudflats with exactly one natural resource: salty lagoon water. The Venetians evaporated it, sold the salt, and then did something cleverer. They used their navy and their treasury to control salt production across the entire Mediterranean, buying it cheap, moving it in Venetian ships, and selling it at Venetian prices. Historians estimate salt profits helped underwrite the fleets and trading ventures that made Venice a superpower. The palaces on the Grand Canal, the gold, the glass, the art. A meaningful part of all that glitter began as seawater drying in the sun. But this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because at the very same time, on the other side of the Sahara Desert, salt was not just making men rich. It was trading for gold and for human beings. In the middle of the Sahara sat the mining settlement of Tagaza, a place so barren that the buildings themselves were constructed from blocks of salt, because salt was the only material available. Enslaved workers cut the ground into massive slabs, which camel caravans, sometimes thousands of camels long, carried south for weeks to the empires of West Africa, lands rich in gold but starved of salt. In the markets of Timbuktu, salt from the desert met gold from the mines. Legend says they traded ounce for ounce, salt for gold. The legend is probably an exaggeration. Prices shifted with scarcity, but the fact that the legend could exist at all tells you what salt was worth. In the Sahara, men spent their entire lives, and often lost them, cutting cooking mineral out of the ground under a killing sun. Kingdoms rose on the trade. The gold that flowed from it ended up in the coins of Europe and the treasuries of North Africa. A rock. All of this for a rock we now buy for pennies. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how one ordinary mineral secretly ran the world, take 1 second and hit subscribe. The Tiny Grand uncovers the grand hidden history of a tiny everyday thing every single week. Now, back to the story, because this is where salt stops building empires and starts destroying them. In France, under the old monarchy, there was a tax called the gabelle. On paper, it was just a salt tax. In practice, it was one of the most hated instruments of government in European history. Here is how it worked. In much of France, every person over the age of about 8 was required by law to buy a minimum amount of salt every year from royal warehouses at prices the crown inflated to many times the salt's actual value. You did not simply pay tax when you bought salt. You were legally obligated to buy overpriced salt whether you wanted it or not. And the rates varied insanely from province to province. Salt could cost dozens of times more on one side of a river than the other. Human beings respond to incentives. So France created an entire underground nation of salt smugglers, the faux sauniers, the false salt makers, ordinary farmers, women, even children, hauling cheap salt from one province to sell in another. And the state responded the way states do. Special police, border patrols, house searches, where inspectors could barge in hunting for illegal salt in your kitchen. Punishments escalated to branding, to years chained as a rower in the royal galleys, and for repeat offenders, to death. In the 18th century, French courts were condemning thousands of people every single year for carrying salt. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about what happened next. The gabelle did not just take people's money. It made the monarchy's injustice visible in every kitchen in France, every single day, at every single meal. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, the lists of grievances sent to the king from villages across the country demanded, over and over, the abolition of the gabelle. It was one of the first things the revolutionaries destroyed, and one of the crimes for which the old regime paid with its head. Napoleon later quietly brought the salt tax back, because governments can never quite let salt go. France did not abolish it fully until after the Second World War. Within living memory, France was still taxing salt. By the age of sail, salt had become something else, a weapon of war, not gunpowder, logistics. Every navy, every army, every ocean crossing ran on salted provisions. Salt beef, salt pork, salt cod. The Basque fishermen who worked the cod grounds of the North Atlantic, the fleets that fed on the fisheries of Newfoundland, they were not just feeding markets. Salt cod was the protein that provisioned ships, plantations, and entire colonial economies. A barrel of salted meat was stored violence. It meant your army could march farther, and your fleet could sail longer than the enemy's, which means that if you could cut off an enemy's salt, you could starve his war. During the American Revolution, the British targeted the colonists' salt works, and salt shortages tormented Washington's army. And during the American Civil War, the Union understood the equation perfectly. No salt meant no preserved rations for Confederate soldiers, no cured pork for the winter, no way to keep an army fed. Union forces repeatedly attacked Southern salt production, and in 1864, they finally smashed the great salt works at Saltville, Virginia, wrecking the kettles and works that supplied much of the Confederacy. Within months, the Confederate war effort was collapsing. Salt did not decide the war by itself, but the men who fought it believed a war could be lost for want of it, and they acted accordingly. And then, almost overnight in historical terms, the ancient reign of precious salt simply ended. The Industrial Revolution killed it. Geologists learned to find the vast salt beds sleeping under Cheshire, under Poland, under Kansas, the dried remains of ancient oceans. Steam pumps pulled brine from the earth by the ton. Vacuum evaporators turned it into mountains of pure white crystal. And refrigeration, the true assassin, made salt's oldest job obsolete. For 10,000 years, salt had been how humanity stopped time, the only barrier between food and rot. Now, a machine did it with cold. Salt, the white gold of empires, became one of the cheapest substances in the industrial world. So the story should end there, but instead, the 20th century gave salt two final plot twists, and both of them came from named individuals with strange, specific obsessions. The first was a businessman, Joy Morton, whose company sold table salt in America. Salt has an annoying habit. It absorbs moisture and clumps into rock inside the box. Around 1911, Morton's company began adding an anti-caking agent so the salt would flow freely, even in humid weather, and then wrapped the idea in one of the great slogans of advertising history: "When it rains, it pours." The little girl with the umbrella, spilling salt behind her, became one of the most recognized logos in America. Salt, the substance of pharaohs and revolutions, was now a brand, competing on convenience. The second twist was far stranger and far more important. In the early 20th century, doctors in the American Midwest and the alpine regions of Europe faced an epidemic: goiter, a grotesque swelling of the thyroid gland in the neck, in some regions affecting a huge share of children. The cause was invisible. The soil, and therefore the food, lacked a trace element called iodine. The fix was maddeningly simple. People needed a pinch of iodine, regularly, for life. But how do you dose an entire population, rich and poor, city and farm, every single day, forever? A Michigan physician named David Murray Cowie championed the answer, borrowing an idea from Switzerland: hide it in the salt. Everyone eats salt, every day, in roughly the same tiny amounts. It is the one substance with guaranteed, universal, self-administered distribution. In 1924, iodized salt went on sale in Michigan, and goiter began to vanish. As iodized salt spread around the world, it did something even bigger. Iodine deficiency is one of the leading preventable causes of intellectual disability in children, and salting it away raised the cognitive baseline of entire nations. Public health researchers rank salt iodization among the cheapest, most effective health interventions in human history. The mineral that once preserved dead pharaohs was now quietly protecting the brains of living children, for a cost of essentially nothing. Salt had one more empire to break first. In 1930, India was ruled by Britain, and Britain, like China, like Venice, like the kings of France before it, held a legal monopoly on salt. Indians were forbidden to collect or sell their own, even though the sea threw salt onto their beaches for free. Every grain had to pass through the colonial system and carry the colonial tax. Mohandas Gandhi understood something that the marchers of the Gabel riots would have recognized instantly. A salt tax is tyranny you can see, sitting on the dinner table of the poorest family in the land. When he announced that his great campaign of civil disobedience against the British Empire would begin with salt, even his allies were baffled. Salt? The empire jails our leaders and bleeds our economy, and you want to protest a condiment? On the 12th of March, 1930, Gandhi walked out of his ashram with 78 followers and started walking toward the sea, 240 miles, on foot, village to village, for 24 days, while crowds and the world's newspapers gathered. And on the morning of April 6th, on the beach at Dundee, he bent down, picked up a lump of natural salt from the mud, and held it up. That was the entire crime, picking up salt. The empire's response made his point for him. Tens of thousands of Indians were arrested for making salt, Gandhi among them. Unarmed protesters marching on a salt works were beaten down in rows, while American journalists watched and cabled the story to the world. Britain kept its salt. It lost something it could not tax: legitimacy. The Salt March became the symbol of the entire independence movement. And 17 years later, The empire that had jailed a man for lifting salt off a beach left India forever. Twice, now, in 2 different centuries, on 2 different continents, mighty states had gone to war against their own people over salt. And both times, the state won the battle, held the monopoly, collected the tax, and shortly afterward ceased to exist. If there is one lesson governments refuse to learn from this mineral, it is that salt is a substance people will forgive you for taxing exactly never. So where did all that power go? Look around your kitchen. Salt is now so cheap that restaurants give it away and cities hurl it onto roads by the truckload. The average price of a pound of table salt is measured in cents. The mineral of Venice and Taghaza has become the definition of worthless, not worth his salt. And yet, here is the final twist. The world has never produced more of it, or depended on it more. Humanity now produces roughly 300 million tons of salt every year, and almost none of it is for eating. Only a small fraction ends up as food. The rest disappears into the invisible machinery of modern life. Salt is the raw feedstock of the chemical industry, the starting point for chlorine and caustic soda, which means it is upstream of your plastics, your paper, your soaps, your medicines, your water treatment. In cold countries, the single biggest use is scattering it on winter roads, where we spread more salt on asphalt in one icy week than a medieval kingdom consumed in a year. Salt did not lose its empire. It went underground, into the supply chain, where nobody thinks about it at all. And in one last perfect irony, now that salt is universally cheap, we have started paying fortunes for it again. Walk into a gourmet shop and you will find fleur de sel, hand-raked from French lagoons, pink salt carved from Himalayan mines, black salt, smoked salt, salt at prices per ounce that would make a Venetian merchant weep with pride. The gabelle is gone. We tax ourselves now, voluntarily, for the romance. So why did salt, of all substances, gather this much history around itself? Because salt sits at the one intersection nothing else occupies. It is a mineral your body absolutely requires and absolutely cannot make, that for 10,000 years also happened to be the only technology capable of stopping food from rotting. Biology made it non-negotiable. Chemistry made it strategic. And scarcity did the rest. Anything that everyone needs and only some people control will generate wealth, taxation, smuggling, and war, as reliably as tides. Salt was never really a flavor. It was leverage. You can still hear the leverage in your language. You earn a salary. You call a good person the salt of the earth. You take dubious claims with a grain of salt. An old sailor is an old salt, and a capable one is worth his salt. The empires fell, the monopolies dissolved, the caravans stopped, and the words kept walking, carrying 2,000 years of salt history into your everyday conversation without you ever noticing the weight. And the man in salt? He is still in Hallstatt, in a manner of speaking. The mine that killed and kept him is now a place where visitors walk galleries first cut in the Bronze Age, past tools the salt refused to let rot. He was a workman, doing a dangerous job for a valuable commodity, no different from the smugglers rowing in French galleys, or the slaves cutting slabs at Taghaza, or the marchers bleeding at the salt works of colonial India. None of them could have imagined the ending. That the substance they suffered for would one day sit in a paper canister on every table on earth, costing almost nothing, noticed by no one. Tonight, at some point, you will probably reach for the salt shaker. You will tip it without thinking over your food, and a few dozen grains of the mineral that built Venice, funded the Great Wall, preserved the pharaohs, broke the French monarchy, armed the world wars of logistics, cured a continent's children, and handed Gandhi an empire's undoing will tumble out. And you will not even look at it. Not bad for a rock. If this story made you see your salt shaker differently, hit subscribe. The Tiny Grand tells the grand hidden history of a tiny everyday thing every week. Drop a comment telling me which ordinary object we should investigate next. And if you learned something new tonight, share this with someone who puts too much salt on their food. They deserve to know what they're holding.